Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Mr. Graves, before lunch we were talking about the fourth question, question D, which was identification of subjects who are intoxicated or experiencing mental health crisis, or suffering from ABD or ED, and actions then to be taken by officers. And we'd started by looking at the training that was available in Police Scotland in around up to the time of 2015. And we'd moved on to look at College of Policing training that was available at that time. And I think we were on page 17 of your report, and we were on paragraph 4 just before lunch. Now, I said at that time I'd like to play a video, and we'll maybe get that organised. That's WIT 00133, and it's a video called Considerations for Safer Restraint. And we've very kindly been granted permission to display this video within the inquiry by the Met, and that permission has been given. But they have asked that we state at the outset a caveat that this video is not reflective of the current curriculum taught.
That's correct. I mean, I produced it and mentioned it in relation to identify work that was being conducted across the rest of the UK in relation to ABD and communication in those circumstances, dating back to the date of this film, which was 2006. Subsequent to that, there have been a number of other videos and other training resources released by both College of Policing and the MPCC in relation to excited delirium and ABD.
Thank you. And so things haven't stood still down at the College of Policing?
No, not in relation to this subject matter, definitely not, no.
But it is reflective of the training that was available from 2006 when the video was produced?
Certainly, yes, it goes back that far, yes.
And up to the time of 2015?
Yes.
And you've explained that that was a video that was shared quite widely,
yes,
with other forces. Now, before we watch the video, it's about 19 minutes long. There are redactions to the video. You mentioned before lunch that there were people who had suffered mental health crises,
yes,
who spoke frankly on the video. But those were individuals who'd actually lived real life experience of coming into contact with the police.
That's correct.
And those individuals have been redacted.
Yes, no problem.
Both video and audio. And the footage of the original initial incident that had given rise to this video being prepared.
Yes, I can give an explanation as to what arose from that video if necessary.
Well, we'll play the video first in its entirety, and then we could maybe come back and we could get some of your comments on it. And the only other thing that I'd wish to point out is this is being fed and streamed through our own system, so very observant people may notice a very slight time lag between the audio and the video, but I've watched it myself and I don't believe it should cause any difficulty. All right, so perhaps we could play this video.
Had gone to on a social evening. During the course of the night, he'd taken some tablets from a friend. He started to violently attack people within the premises. This resulted in him being ejected by the door supervisors. When he was outside the premises, he continued to attack people who were waiting to go inside. This culminated in him actually attacking the glass window of the doors as he tried to get back inside. He then moved across to a local street trader who he attacked unprovoked, striking the man a number of times around the head. This caused the door supervisors to come out of the premises, engage with him and managed to tackle him to the floor pending the arrival of police.
I was one of the first officers to turn up on scene with a colleague. We turned up to see the man being restrained on the floor by 10 door supervisors. I remember one of the bouncers saying, you know, I've given this bloke 10 out of 10. He's unbelievably strong and, you know, we can't hold him. He wasn't English, so communication was difficult. He couldn't understand. We was trying to tell him to calm down, but there was no getting through to him. About another 2-3 minutes before other units arrived, I had some concerns, the fact that we weren't going to be able to hold him for much longer.
Anybody travelling past, and I use the analogy of the Clapham omnibus, a snapshot of seeing 12 or 14 officers around an individual may give the impression of disproportionality, that the police have been excessive. And as the bus moves off, that question mark lingers in their mind.
At first we tried to get him up on his feet, but he was still kicking out and trying to headbutt officers. We then decided to carry him into the van. We were still struggling in the van, still kicking and struggling violently, trying to bite officers, etc. It was when we got into the backyard that one of the other officers in the van noticed that his breathing had shallowed. He'd calmed down quite considerably in a matter of seconds. And then once we got into the backyard, we realised something was wrong. You come to work every day, and the last thing you expect is for a man to die the way he did. What's the fact that 1 minute he's there fighting and hell-bent on hurting you, and then all of, within 30 minutes he's dead. It's very difficult to understand.
The incident was in 2003, and that was before the mental health and restraint review. Now, there was a thorough investigation into that incident, and that investigation found that the officers had done absolutely nothing wrong at all. But the question still remained, was there anything that we could do differently in that situation to try and protect that individual who's being restrained and to protect the officers?
Well, ABD is acute behavioural disorder, and it's sometimes known as excited delirium, and it's in a state of extreme agitation. Now, this can affect anybody, in fact, if they get themselves what you might just call wound up enough. But it's much more common in psychiatric illness, where perhaps someone believes they're being persecuted or attacked or under threat, or in association with substance misuse such as drugs or alcohol. Finally, though, there are some medical conditions such as inflammation of the brain or respiratory failure that can also lead to these sorts of situations. The thing they have in common is the state of extreme agitation, and with it a large amount of adrenaline pumping around the body.
Are you with her? Are you the one? Where is she? Come on, where is she? Come on! Where is she? Shut up! Shut up!
It's your job, and you just can't stand back and let the man run around and hurt anybody that comes into his path.
All the recruits that come to Hendon come to us for 4 days of officer safety training input, which is their foundation training. It's geared up for them to be able to police the streets of London safely and effectively.
Okay team, moving on then from our safe approach, which we've covered already, we're going to look at people's danger cues, non-verbal communication that they exhibit to us, and we're going to need to react to it, okay? We'll roll through a scenario and then we'll break it down and talk about it.
The course actually entails tactical communication, or the use of communication skills to gain control, legislation and the use of force and the justification of that force, the use of police equipment such as batons and handcuffs and CS spray, and also the restraint of individuals in restraint holds.
Show me your hands. Stay away from me, just stay where you are. I just want to see your hands.
Okay.
Good, and we'll freeze it.
Preferred approach is obviously to avoid the use of force.
Thinking about the officer safety model, what's happened to my threat assessment? Yeah, because why isn't this person going to show me his hands? And then what does he do to me? Yeah, he closed down my personal space, okay? And from here now my hands come up and I'm just doing a single-handed push away, creating distance from him. My hands are up here. And I'm telling him to get back! At this point now, I've come up into my defensive position, and now I'm thinking about why is this person being cooperative with me? If he's thinking emotionally, and I can consider that and adopt my non-verbals, my danger cues to him by lowering my shoulders, put my hands out, saying, I just want to talk to you. Here's my hands, it's not a problem, okay?
Being a good communicator can minimise the need to use force. it is always a good option, and it is why we spend so much time on it within the officer safety to actually emphasise its importance within the arsenal of effects that officers can use.
We know that every day people are getting involved in conflict situations, genuinely because, when we've looked at the emotional rational brain, they're in that emotional brain. And that could be somebody who's maybe under the influence, drink drugs, or have a mental illness. I need to use this model. And it's basically got 4 stages that we go through. And they are intervention, calm, report and control.
Excuse me! What? Excuse me! Hey! Shut up.
It's not always the case that just because someone's acting strangely that they're going to act aggressively. You have to be wary of the fact that things may turn violent towards you.
Where is she? She sent you, didn't she?
Stay there for me and listen to me.
Sierra X-ray from 5009.
Oh, you spoke to us!
There are a number of techniques that officers can use to try and approach persons who are in an emotional state. Removing hats, switching the radio down, trying to approach slowly, making sure that the person is aware of your presence.
Okay? You want to go and see Katie?
You're gonna
I'm not going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. Tell me what your name is.
You're going to take me to the needles? Take
No, I'm
me
not
to
going to
Bill?
take you to the
Yes,
needles.
you are!
I'm not.
I know it! Oh, God!
You don't want to go there, I'm not going to take you there.
Where is she? Where is she?
Talk to me.
She sent you.
Tell me your
Where is
name.
she?
Tell me
Come
your
on.
name. I'm here to try and help you. You tell me your name. I'm here to try and help you. You tell me your name, I will try and get you to go and see Katie. What's your name?
It's George.
George! Hi,
You know
I'm
my name.
I'm Laurie, okay? My name's Laurie.
How do you know?
This is
How do you know?
Jeanette. You just told me.
Where is she? How do you know?
George. Katie, yeah?
Where is she?
How about we
Where
go
is she?
together and find Katie?
You want to bring me to the farm? That's what it is, isn't it?
I'm not going to take you.
The van on a silent approach, please. The van on a silent approach.
You're going to take me, aren't you?
I'm not going to take you.
Adrenaline affects police officers the same way it could affect anyone else. You can start to feel your stomach becoming tighter, your own heightened awareness. If that occurs, you've got to start taking deep breaths to try and calm your own response.
Okay, you, me, and Juliet will go in the van together.
Please.
Come on, come with
Please
me,
tell me
George.
where she-
Okay, sit down and George, listen to me. I'm going to move round into the other side there, and you and me can have a nice chat as we're going back to the station.
You have to be aware that the situation can change at short notice. Someone may be acting in a certain way and quickly they could switch and act in another way.
There will always be a time when officers do have to physically restrain, and obviously that is the main element of risk for both the officers concerned and also the persons that are being dealt with by the officers. So we put a lot of emphasis on the training around the safe restraint of individuals.
If somebody steps away with a straight arm and they're resisting us, it's very difficult for us to put an effective restraint on. So we might decide to do what? Yeah, cause a distraction or a dysfunction.
If sometimes you get hit in a muscle group, you actually lose the use of that limb for a short period of time, whilst the muscle recovers from the strike.
Gain control. I'm going to deliver a knee strike at the same time into the common peroneal. Stop resisting! Get down on the floor now! Get down on the floor! Once I'm in this position, I'm going to talk him into a position of control.
In compliance will actually allow us to safely restrain with a small degree of force.
Assist me by
Well, if you're struggling, you're doing a large amount of exercise, essentially. So you're burning through a huge number of calories, you're consuming a lot of oxygen, and you're creating a lot of carbon dioxide you have to breathe off. Now, the problem with restraint can be that in the act of having to restrain someone, you're pinning their muscles, and you're pinning also the muscles they use to breathe. And that could mean that they can't get enough oxygen in, and they can't breathe the carbon dioxide off. Now, not breathing the carbon dioxide off makes the blood more acid. This gets them increasingly agitated. They fight even more, so the restraint has to get harder. And if this progresses, this is a vicious cycle that can lead to someone actually having complete respiratory failure and ultimately death.
What do I need to consider now? What's my main concern with this person? Fantastic positional asphyxia, because there's a reason why I'm restraining him and he's on the floor now, and this is going to be restricting his breathing. So how can I find out if he's breathing okay? Talk to him, good. What's your name, mate?
Nick.
Nick, mate, you're under arrest, do you understand?
Yes.
He's talking to me, so he's breathing. In your groups of 3 then, please, you can go away and practice that, okay? Good stuff. Cheers, Nick.
Every officer who comes through Hendon has to achieve the required standard and competency in the application of these various skills. There's also a written exam, so they have to have the underpinning knowledge to be able to evidence and explain why techniques work and how they work. Once they're posted out of Hendon to their divisions or boroughs, they're doing 12 hours refresher training every year, and that's for every officer up to including the rank of Chief Inspector.
Well, in these states of advanced agitation, adrenaline's coursing around the body, and the body is blocking out any signals it thinks are irrelevant to survival, and one of those is pain. And so using pain compliance as a method of control in these circumstances is largely useless, and in fact it might even make the patient more agitated than they were before.
Because so far we've looked at, from the ordinary police hold, using pain and compliance to take somebody to the floor. But if we've got concerns that might not be effective to start off with, then we could look at using multi-officer and then moving from there.
If people are not compliant to pain, i.e. they may be suffering from drug abuse, or it may be alcohol related, or it can even be mental illness, that tends to take away a person's ability to feel pain, and obviously then pain compliance techniques are ineffective in those circumstances.
Ourselves, we're going to move in, shoulder locks, pull ourselves in, safety officer's going to control the head, and we're going to turn at the same time, driving the person's weight forward, supporting their weight. Our hands have to go under their shoulders. Because
the pain compliance techniques or the dysfunction techniques aren't working, the only way that you can then safely restrain an individual is by force of numbers.
Don't resist, you're under arrest. Walk forwards, follow my feet. Relax, good. Okay, need you to go down onto your knees, 1 knee at a time, very slowly. We're holding you. Good. Now put your forehead onto the ground. Excellent.
An individual within the team takes control of the restraint. That's always been identified as the person at the head, because they're in the best position to communicate openly with that person, monitor the person's condition, i.e. their pallor, whether they're breathing, etc. So that person really is the safety officer, is in charge of the restraint.
It'll all be done under control of Donna, the safety officer, because she'll have control of the head.
It's not really a matter of rank, it's a matter of skills and training. All officers of all ranks receive the same training, so any officer should be able to adopt the role of safety.
Are we going to leave this person face down now for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long the ambulance is going to be? No, so what can we do? I'm going to take hold of the hip and shoulder, and when we're all happy, we're going to roll this person onto the side. I could perhaps hook the arm under my knee. I'm going to just support the weight so they're balanced on their side. Go away and practice that from the floor, please, in your groups.
Okay, just relax.
Good, turn the arm the other way, Remember the shoulder rolls forward, that's it. Perfect.
Still breathe okay?
Yeah, good.
Bring it to the farm, that's what it is, isn't it?
The van on the side of the approach, please. The van.
Where is she? Where is she?
Let go of the lady. Let go.
Let go of the lady. Where is she?
Listen to me. Let go of the lady. Listen.
Oh no!
Patients in this agitated state often genuinely feel that any intervention by you is a threat to their very life, so they think they're fighting for their lives. And it's partly, therefore, the adrenaline that helps increase muscle performance and makes them supremely strong, but it's also a mental effect. They are using every muscle fibre they've got, and they're driving those muscles to a point that they would never normally find tolerable. So that's how the strength can be so remarkable.
I think it's very difficult to prepare people fully for a full-on violent restraint, but the training is geared around giving people the best that we can within safe limits to prepare them for the techniques and tactics that they're going to have to employ to safely restrain violent or potentially violent individuals.
Okay, I'm not very happy with this, I'm going to call an ambulance.
As soon as you suspect that he may be suffering acute behavioural disorder, you must recognise it as a medical emergency and he goes to A&E.
On his side so he can breathe, okay? Turn your head the other way, sir.
As soon as possible.
Okay, Flora, can you roll? Lie still, you can be okay, we're here to help you. Okay?
If they are requiring the sorts of levels of restraint that compromise breathing, that make the patient's blood more acid, that in itself is life-threatening, and in any of these circumstances, the patient is best seen and assessed and managed in an accident and emergency department.
Just stay still, Phil, get the doors.
When I've taken the man to casualty staff aren't aware of the term acute behavioural disorder, and I would explain his behaviour, the lack of pain, the heat, the extreme aggression, and I would then go forward to say, well, in the Metropolitan Police we call it acute behavioural disorder.
He's been like this all the way through. He's stopped struggling so hard now.
Be careful, just stay down.
There are going to be situations where you're going to need 4 or 5 officers to restrain one individual, because that's the best way to do it, where you're going to cause less injury to the officers, less injury to the person concerned. And to an onlooker, it may look excessive, but that's the right way to do it and the safe way to do it.
On both occasions I've dealt with individuals, within half an hour you can sit down and have a rational conversation with them. All traces of any aggressive behaviour have totally disappeared.
You are always going to get violent people. You are always going to get situations where you can't talk the person down and they're going to react in a violent way. And we just have to make sure that we all have the skills, we've practiced those skills, so that when the incident happens, it comes as second nature.
He was hell-bent on hurting anybody. Innocent members of the public could have been walking by, he could have attacked them, and you just can't stand back and let the man run around and hurt anybody that comes into his path. You know, he's the strongest man I think I've ever come across, the most violent man I've ever come across. I don't think the training could ever prepare you for the strength of that man that night. Nothing will prepare you for that, I don't think.
Video's under 20 minutes, and obviously sections have been redacted. We've not seen the entire video, but a lot of information has been shared through that video. And just thinking about that as a means of communicating training to students, do you have any comments to make about that?
We found it invaluable as a training tool to get out to such a large amount of officers. I mean, at the time, the Metropolitan Police was in excess of 30,000 officers, so that went out and every officer saw that, you know, which gets that message out. It was then supported by emphasis within the refresher training on the physical skills that were displayed in the video. So again, that reinforced the techniques and tactics that were shown. So we found it an invaluable tool in getting that message across.
So that was shown to not just probationers, but to
that was rolled out.
Existing staff.
Yeah, that was rolled out. As I mentioned on the video about our 12-hour refresher process. That went out across that annual refresher, so every officer saw it.
Within 1 year?
Yes.
And how many officers was that?
That was every operational officer up to and including the rank of Chief Inspector.
Thank you. And from all the materials you reviewed in Police Scotland at that time, which related to this topic, was there any equivalent within Police Scotland that you saw?
Not at that time. I couldn't see anything. As I say, I am aware of other videos that were circulating and were being viewed. I haven't found them in the bundle, and I'm not aware as whether or not Police Scotland were actually utilising those resources.
Right. Can we talk about the content of the video, please? Obviously, it started as a result of a violent incident. I think someone on the video said it was from 2003.
It was, yes.
And a man had died. And then the Met took steps to see what better training could be provided. Is that correct?
That's correct. Mr. Patrick actually mentions about the review that took place just before the video. The video was a recommendation from that review that we looked at creating a video that could be shown not only to officers but also shown to outside agencies to sort of better advise them on police tactics and why we do what we do. So it wasn't just shown within police forums; it was shown within a lot of other mental health forums and other interested groups.
And would outside agencies include ambulance services or no?
Yeah. I'll say the ambulance service were involved in part of the review, as were NHS staff, to look at the protocols in relation to taking people in restraint to hospitals, and you know, a memorandum of understanding between NHS trusts in London with the police, so that they understood why we were bringing them in and how they would appear when they were being brought to A&E.
So there wasn't just the video being created internally, it was reaching out to other organisations.
Yes,
as well.
and there was also additional policy and standard operating procedures that supported the training and the video.
And you mentioned before lunch it was an actor who was used and 2 trainers who demonstrated how to deal with the man who was having a mental health crisis.
That's correct, yeah.
That was the man in the denim shirt.
Yes.
And there were 2 examples that seemed to me on the video. There was one where he was eventually escorted to the van, and then there was a second one where he had to be restrained.
Yes.
And he was lifted to the van, and an ambulance was called at that time. Can you talk about the distinctions and why those 2 examples were chosen?
We wanted to show the fact that communication being a key factor of the handling and the dealing with such situations, and that on occasion that can work, but also that on occasions it won't work. And the reason, particularly on that one, is the fact that he approaches and starts physical intervention or physical interaction with a female passerby. So police have to step in for the safety of that individual and restrain him. So it was to show both sides of the options that might take place in such a situation. But then, if restraint is considered, that it's done in the right way, it's minimised time-wise to the least amount of time on the floor in the prone position, and then also the additional bits about having medical assistance en route, and the fact that the paramedic actually escorts in the van with the officer. The other option would have been to go have the discussion: do we go in the ambulance and the police go in the back of the ambulance with the subject?
And with the second example that was demonstrated, am I right in saying the difference there was a member of the public arrived and was approached, and contact was made between her and the man suffering from the mental health crisis. And would that change the situation?
Well, it then increases the risk to that individual, because we don't know what that individual is going to do to the member of the public. So interaction, intervention has to be taken at that time, because there is a heightened risk. So it was to identify that change in the threat assessment or the dynamic assessment of the situation, and that at some point there is a likelihood, as I said on the video, there is a likelihood that at some point physical intervention by police officers is likely to have to take place.
And I think you mentioned that on the video itself.
Yes.
And does this go back to the national decision-making model, where we see phase 1 is intelligence gathering, information gathering?
Yeah, even pre that, there was a mention on there about the officer safety model. The officer safety model is another version of the conflict management model. Predates the NDM, but the process is exactly the same. It's just a slightly simplified version. The NDM was brought in 2012, so it post-dates this video.
Right. But when the new information was available for the lady coming up the stairs and being approached by the subject, that is new information, and then a decision had to be taken at that point.
Yeah, so something's happened. Your reaction to that is reassessing the risk or the threat. The threat level has been increased to this individual. Therefore, what is now my tactical option? My tactical option has to be intervention. So the officers intervene and take hold of the individual to prevent them from causing injury to that female.
So the officers no longer simply rely on communication skills, they then have to intervene, and that's when the restraint takes place.
Yes, but the important bit as well with that is just to show that communication is important throughout the whole process. Don't stop talking, don't just, I've now ruled that out, I'm going to move on to something else. The communication is part of that process throughout the whole of the restraint period.
And during that restraint on the video, did we see people telling the person they had to be calm and they were trying to help him?
Yes, just trying that constant communication, hoping that at some point something will get through and something will trigger that cooperation from them.
So that doesn't stop even during the restraint?
No, definitely not.
And we also saw one of the officers who was involved in the restraint using his radio and saying he was going to call an ambulance. Can you talk through that?
Again, as I said earlier about this ABD equals A&E, it's understanding that this person is in crisis of some description. We're not sure of the cause of the crisis, but the fact that that early identification, the person is acting bizarrely, their communication style is erratic, they're not really making a lot of sense. So those early identifications, before any physical activity has taken place, that early identification makes the officer understand that this person may at some point need to be restrained and therefore may need medical intervention of some description. So getting that medical assistance to them as soon as possible, knowing what delays can be with getting ambulance crews, etc., getting that running as early as possible.
And then I think towards the end of that we saw oxygen being given to the person who was on the...
Yeah, so you heard the officer basically say that the person is breathing heavily through the exertion, and Dr. Shepherd explains that on the video. So it was about the use of the medical intervention, having the paramedics there and hoping that they can give medical assistance more so than what police officers can with basic first aid. You've got that much higher level of medical intervention available to you should the person need it.
Thank you. And as well as that, you mentioned earlier, there's also a well-being aspect to this.
Yes.
That officers who've been involved in a situation such as this, we saw some officers talking about the experience that they had regarding the 2003 incident. And is that something else that is important that can be shared through the video?
Yes, I think making valid points in relation to you don't understand until you've actually been involved in a situation like that just how strong and how difficult that type of situation and restraint can be, and why we use multiple officers to try and control the situation and individuals in that position. And as I say, it just tries to heighten their awareness in relation to should they come into contact with an individual, not only do they know what's happened, but they know what to possibly expect if they do have to physically restrain.
And as a training tool, how effective is it for other probationers or students to hear the first-hand experience from their colleagues?
I think that's very, very important. As I said, I think also the redacted sections were extremely beneficial because it gave the service user, as we would call them, somebody who's been through the system, who has had interaction with police when in a crisis, being able to tell the police officers, through the video, this is how I felt, this is how I perceived what you were trying to do to me or what you were trying to say to me, and then being able to match that against what we advise in relation to best practice in such situations.
So although we couldn't observe ourselves on the video today, individual users who have experienced mental health crises, as part of the training video, officers were shown footage from people who have experienced it and how
Yes, it was
during
live interviews of them telling about their experiences of being dealt with by police officers.
So for actual students, probationers, officers who were watching this video in real life, they would have had access to all of that information as well. Let's think about the hypothetical reasonable officer. If that officer had watched this video up to that period in 2015, what difference do you think that would have made to them in handling an incident where someone is suffering either from intoxication or a mental health crisis?
I think it would have assisted with early identification, recognising that bizarre behaviour, recognising that initial contact and viewing of the individual, and it would have also hopefully triggered that thought process in relation to this behaviour is out of the ordinary, it's bizarre, it's unusual, therefore looking at triggering that thought process around excited delirium or ABD with that in mind, and then obviously that would then kick into place things like getting an ambulance running early on, requiring that medical assistance or that medical intervention.
So it could have made some significant difference to
I believe it could have made
their
a difference,
actions. And can we move on then, please, and look at the up-to-date position? And I think you've already explained that College of Policing and the Met have explained in relation to this video that reflects their previous training, not their current training. But if we could maybe go back to your report, and if we could look at page 18 and look at paragraph 6 on page 18 of your report. And you comment here about, page 18, paragraph 6, there we are. And you comment here about the 2017 OST manual, which reflects the more up-to-date position and module 3. And you describe this as greatly improved, the section on communication.
Yes.
And you say that section 9 deals with alcohol and drugs. But you say it does not, however, appear to mention mental ill health. And then you comment on a communication PowerPoint, which was another training tool that you looked at. And that you say that has extensive input on this matter.
Yes, it has a lot more information and more in-depth information than the manual has.
Right. And so if it was used, if training was given both with the manual and the PowerPoint, that would provide a much greater coverage of.
Yes, it would, yes.
And you then said pages 22 to 34 cover communication with subjects with alcohol, drug, mental health crisis, and other issues that can impact their ability to communicate. And that could be a disability of some description,
It could be, yes.
a language barrier.
Yeah, it could be language barrier, it could be hearing impairment or sight impairment.
And the mental health PowerPoint also provides some very good information and strategies for dealing with these situations. So as well as the communication PowerPoint, there is now a mental health PowerPoint.
Yes, and supporting documentation, standard operating procedures, etc., specifically in relation to mental health.
So it does sound like you say this is greatly improved, the training, and that the position now is much better than
Yes,
it was
yes.
then.
The only thing I wasn't able to establish, as I say, is what resources were on top of that, such as videos, were being used to support the message.
All right. And could we have a very brief look at a statement by, let me just check, Inspector David Bradley, SBPI 00408. And Inspector Bradley has given evidence to the inquiry, but also this is his statement, which I'll show you. And if we can look at 127. And perhaps if we could look at 126, we'll see that this whole section deals with ABD. So he's talking about various training materials, PowerPoint and such like. If we look at 127 again, he says, we should, however, again, recognise that in isolation a large list of causes may be considered ideal. But in the operational environment, when faced with an individual perhaps suffering from ABD, we should be realistic in what our expectations are around the amount officers will recall, depending on how long since they were last trained, and the impact of the operational environment they are working in. So whilst we provide the best information we can, we have to temper our expectations around officer performance in respect of this. I think we would be challenged to find an officer who was perhaps, say, 6 months from the recertification training, who could give you a list of 7 causes or 13 signs and symptoms of ABD. So whilst we continue to reinforce key training messages like these, again, we are realistic in our expectations of officer performance, given 2 training days a year are allocated to operational safety training and the associated operational first aid programme. Now, I should say that the current position, as I understand it, is now that officers in Scotland have 2 days of training, not the 1 that they had in 2015. I'm interested in this, really a reservation, I suppose, that's being expressed by Inspector Bradley about officers' ability to recall. Say, for example, they're given much detail and long lists of symptoms and signs, and in fact your own report provides a very detailed list on page 17 of signs and symptoms and such like. And he's expressing reservations that officers might not be able to retain all of that information. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would agree in context of what the message he's trying to put across. It's one of many things that officers have to take on board through their training. I said earlier, I think one of the big things is it's not about the causes. That's not irrelevant, but it's not important for the officers to know the causes, so maybe less emphasis on that. But the signs and symptoms are the important thing to trigger officers down that path. So emphasis on that rather than the cause. Also the fact that it really depends on how much emphasis is placed upon that particular subject in balance against some of the other ones. And I've sort of touched on that as I've given my evidence, is the fact that emphasis on things like communication, this and other relevant areas of officer safety may be more impactful in relation to the public and police safety than, say, application of a set of handcuffs. I'm not saying that's not something that officers don't need to know. They do need to know, but the time and emphasis that is placed on that within their training, possibly the balance needs to be looked at and addressed.
So something you touched on yesterday and today about the time that's spent on individual topics.
Yes.
You said yesterday that if they identify maybe areas where further training is required through data and information that they have from complaints are going up or injuries are occurring, is that the sort of area where further refinements could be done on a year-to-year basis?
Yes, I mean, as I say, that constant review of the syllabus and the emphasis needs to be constantly looked at, and I'm aware that a process is in place. But to address that comment, if we have evidence or intelligence that it is becoming something that officers can't recall or can't fully list, then that would indicate to me that that's an area that we need to focus on going forward to make sure that officers do have that information and that understanding of the process.
Thank you. And if we can stay on page 18 of your report, and if we look at paragraph 7, so we'll move away from Inspector Bradley's statement, but really paragraph 7 on page 18 effectively says you consider the training currently provided by Police Scotland in communication and specifically dealing with the issues that we've been looking at this afternoon, and you describe that as good. So the current training system is good.
Yes.
Thank you. And it stands up well against what other areas in the UK are training? It
does, yes. As I said, my caveat on that was I think there should be some link between the communication side of it and the effects of ABD and those causes and triggers, and just to make that link between the two standalone inputs, really.
So ensure that any references to dealing with ABD aligns all comments about it doesn't really matter if it's drugs intoxication, alcohol intoxication, or mental health symptoms.
Yeah.
And that is consistent across the board on all the materials.
Yes, because that's not going to be known until some sort of investigation is carried out at the hospital, blood tests, etc., or getting the medical history of the individual. It's understanding the signs and symptoms, that bizarre behaviour, that unusual, possibly violent behaviour. Why is that occurring? Is it out of the ordinary? Then triggering an officer's thought process down that ABD route.
Thank you. And then moving on to another aspect of question E, And we've looked at this to some extent. If we turn to page 20, question E, tactical options for approaching an individual reported to be on a public road carrying a knife, and Roman numeral 3 is de-escalation. Now I've taken a number of comments from you regarding tactical communications. I think there's evidence before the chair that the old term for that was, the new term for that is de-escalation.
Yeah.
That'd be correct. And I think at section 1, you refer to the 2013 manual in looking at the training that was available in around 2015 with Police Scotland. And you comment that it has 3 pages, which provides basic information but little in the way of practical advice. And it mentions empathy on page 7 under active listening, but there's no advice as to how to do this. And it does not appear to have been a priority in the syllabus, which focused on the physical skills of the programme.
Yes.
And I think that's consistent with what you've been saying earlier.
Yes.
And so in this respect, at paragraph 2, you say, I would not say that this was, and the question had been, was it fit for purpose?
Yes.
So you don't think at that time, on the 2013 manual, on the basis of that and the materials you've seen, that it was fit for purpose?
Yes, there didn't appear to be a great deal of advice or guidance to officers. From the video you've just watched, you saw the MET model of intervention, calm, report, control. That was included into the rewrite of the manual in 2012, so it was available as across the whole of the UK. A lot of other forces before that had their own models and their own sort of de-escalation or confrontation handling models and methodologies that they used.
And in paragraph 2, you say, the second sentence, the lack of impetus on the important tactical option of de-escalation linked to a good grounding in communication skills would mean that officers are lacking one of their most valuable tools.
Yes, as I said earlier, I still believe that it's one of the most important tools an officer can have.
And you do recognise that this can be something that can be learnt over time and with experience, but officers who do not fully understand or are unable to utilise these skills are much more likely to revert to use of force to achieve their goals.
That's correct, yes.
So if they are unable to use correctly the communication skills, if maybe their skills are poor, if perhaps the training is not adequate, then that means they're more likely to use force.
Yes, it can also be a behavioural or an inbuilt psyche within the officer. They have a certain way of communicating which can, escalate rather than de-escalate.
And if we can look at a statement of Inspector Young, SBPI 00153, if we can look at paragraph 42, so Inspector Young was asked about training on de-escalation round about the 2013 manual 2015, and he was asked about what was taught as part of their probationer training about de-escalation, and he says the term de-escalation wasn't used. It wasn't a concept that was taught back then. However, the 2013 manual did have a section on what was called tactical communications, which we've looked at, yes, which is the older term for de-escalation. A lot of the principles of tactical communications are similar to what we term now as de-escalation. We covered tactical communications in part of the OST theory. So that 3-hour input that the officers would get on day 1 of their initial course would include discussions on tactical communications. And tactical communications is basically that two-way process of speaking and listening to gain a tactical advantage. We didn't use the term, if we can move that, sorry, de-escalation. It was more about using tactical communications to obtain compliance back then. So we informed officers about the best ways to communicate, i.e. listening, how to use your words, active listening. The model of tactical communications is what we called a 5-step positive style, and there's reference to that in the manual. We would train officers to try and talk to persons who were perhaps breaking the law or committing a crime, and we broke that down into 5 steps. Reading that, can you comment on that approach?
I appreciate de-escalation may not have been a term that was used, but my interpretation, tactical communication is a tactical option that you can use. Within that, that is a tool that assists with managing conflict or managing confrontation. So there are other things. I mean, there's no mention in there about body language, about how you stand, how you portray yourself, whether you have a threatening demeanour or you have a relaxed, calming demeanour. There's lots of other things and lots of other tips which wouldn't fall directly within tactical communication. We mentioned on the video of simple things like turning the radio down, taking your hat off. They wouldn't directly sit under tactical communication, but I would expect them to sit under an input on conflict management, and as part of that conflict management, the skills to de-escalate or calm down a situation rather than escalate a situation.
Thank you. Can I also look at another statement that the Chair has from David Agnew? Mr. Agnew was one of the trainers at around 2014, 2015, and his statement is SBPI 00109. And I'm interested in paragraph 17. Now, we've heard evidence in the inquiry that David Agnew was the instructor who trained PC Kaylee Good, and she was a probationer.
Yes.
And he carried out a training course with her, which she attended in February 2015, so a matter of months before the incident. And that training course was based and used the 2013 manual. And we've also heard evidence that David Agnew trained PC Alan Smith to become a trainer, and he had the manual. So looking at paragraph 17, he says, I'm asked what training officers were given in 14-15 in relation to de-escalation. The officers were trained to de-escalate when control has been achieved. So I'll just repeat that. The officers were trained to de-escalate when control has been achieved. So de-escalate as and when is appropriate would probably be the message, but de-escalation must follow compliance immediately. Again, it's situation dependent. If anything is above level 1 of the profiled offender, then the officer may not be able to de-escalate. Level 2 is verbal and gestures, so if they're shouting, swearing, they're in my face, then at that stage I may not be able to de-escalate. But once compliance has been achieved, and that may be physical or verbal or a combination of the two, then de-escalation should immediately follow, because there is no requirement for further uses of force if the officer or officers have deemed the situation to be controlled and compliant. I wonder if you can reflect on what's said there and tell us if you have any concerns about that.
I do. From the very sort of second sentence, the idea of de-escalation is to prevent escalation or the requirement for officers to use force. That statement, or the number of statements are below, that you would never consider it on anything above a level 1, i.e. compliance. So the person is doing exactly what you ask them to do. In that circumstances, there is no reason for de-escalation because you're at the lowest level, you're getting the compliance that you require. The idea of de-escalation skills is for dealing with somebody above that level to get them back down to that level. So it's an idea of being able to pull that person back down by using your verbal skills and your positioning and your demeanour and your behaviour to try and get them to match you and come down, back down to that level 1. To say that it's not a viable option or it's not something that was encouraged within the training of anything above a level 1, I find quite difficult to believe.
So if someone had been attending a course where this was taught, as described by David Agnew, would you have concerns about what impact that would have on them when they go out into operational areas and respond to incidents?
I think if that was the method, the message that was being given by the trainer, it would indicate to an officer being trained by them that de-escalation was a tool that they wouldn't use on anything other than a compliant person. And as I said, if the person is compliant, there's no need to de-escalate them, because they're at that bottom level where you want them to be. You want them compliant. So if you've already got that, de-escalation is a useless tool. You don't need it.
And so presumably, whether the person who's being trained is a probationer, that's a concern, but also if the trainer is being trained on how to be a trainer, would you have a concern about that message being shared more widely?
I think it would certainly lead officers to the fact that it's not to be considered when dealing with anybody who is offering any form of resistance, whether that be verbal, physical, not to be something that can assist in the dealing with that subject.
And so in relation to this aspect, you've expressed the view in paragraph 2 of this part of your report that officers are really lacking one of their most valuable tools.
Yes.
Thank you. Could you give me a moment, please? Would that be an appropriate time to...
We'll take a 15-minute break.
Ms Graham.
Thank you. Mr Greaves, I think a couple of things I want to just clarify from before the break. The ACC in London at the time, am I right in saying that's Brian Paddock?
Yes.
Not Patrick?
No, Mr. Paddock.
And the doctor that we saw in the video, was that a doctor that appeared to be a Dr Hugh Montgomery?
It is,
that
yes.
correct?
He's one of the experts that actually sat on the IMSAP panel, and he's done quite a bit on death related with restraint.
Thank you. And there was mention of a Dr Shepherd, was that something?
Yes, he was another medical advisor that was advising the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Thank you. So he wasn't actually on the video?
No, but he was one of the advisors for the video content, yes.
Thank you very much. So we've been talking about de-escalation, and we've been looking at page 20 of your report. And I'd like to move on to the current position that we have in Police Scotland. And I think what you say at section 6, which is actually moving on to page 20.
21, yeah.
Sorry, 21. The communication section in the 2017 OST manual has been greatly improved. And so you've reflected on the 2017 manual, the up-to-date position, and you see a great improvement in that. But you do say that it is still only one page, but contains practical tips for de-escalation.
Yes.
So although it's not covering numerous pages, you commend on the practical tips which are now provided.
Yes.
I wonder if you could help the Chair understand what you mean by practical tips.
Some of the tips I was talking about earlier in relation to things like body position, stance, taking a hat off, introducing yourself, giving a name, little tips like that which are used to be able to build that rapport or that connection with an individual, and therefore give you a better opportunity to be able to correctly communicate with them.
So the student, things that the student can do in practice when they're out responding to an incident that may assist with communication.
That's correct, yes.
And they may not even be words or conversation, but it can be body language and things that they're doing.
Yes, as I said, things like the stance and the way that you present yourself. Men have a tendency to stand tall, push their shoulders back. That in others can be seen as an aggressive stance. So simple things like softening your shoulders, softening your knees, just making your stance look a lot softer and a lot less threatening, can be used to communicate a message in relation to de-escalation.
And you also comment on a PowerPoint that's now available or has been available in relation to operational safety training and first aid. And you say that has input that covers a number of strategies and tactics that can be used for de-escalation.
That's correct, yes.
So the combination of the up-to-date manual plus other materials such as the PowerPoints can be used to improve and have improved the de-escalation training that's provided.
I would say yes, yes.
Thank you. And I think you say it's 7 that, and this was in connection to a question about is that training fit for purpose? And you say in essence this skill should be the cornerstone of the training from which all the other tactical options emanate.
Yes.
And you describe de-escalation as a core competency.
Yes.
And then at 8 you talk about the training today being far better than that provided 9 years ago. Far better.
Yes.
And you've also provided us with some information regarding the current College of Policing training. And as we've described before, that you've talked about the conflict management guidelines, and you've given us appendices D to F, which are attached to your report and contain excerpts of parts of the guidelines in conflict management by the College of Policing.
Yes, there's some specific guidance documents assisting with conflict management.
And the Chair can obviously consider those in due course. At section 10 here, you say these are all contained within the new PPST programme, currently being delivered across all forces in England and Wales. I think I asked you about that earlier.
Yes, that's the public and police safety training.
Can you tell the Chair a little more about this new programme that's being rolled out?
It's been rolled out over the last sort of 18 months to 2 years across the rest of the UK. At the moment, I believe there are only 3, or maybe slightly off on that. The last time I checked, there were 3 force areas that had not signed up to the new process. Police Scotland are one of them, as far as I'm aware. British Transport Police are another, and there is one other within the UK who are still putting in place what is required. It's very much a scenario-based and performance-based refreshers course. The trainers that are delivering it have gone centrally to the College of Policing and been given additional skills and additional input on how to run safe and effective scenarios and guidance on what the content of those scenarios should be. There are various forces that have published articles on LinkedIn in relation to their officers going through the new programme. It is receiving very, very favourable feedback from officers undertaking the training. The trainers are finding it far more beneficial in relation to being able to get the message across to staff. So I say at the moment, you know, we've known about scenario training for a long, long time, and that it is the best way forward. Yes, it is labour intensive. Yes, it is resource and can be financially a larger burden, but the benefits must greatly outweigh those concerns.
And you say here that it's currently being delivered across all forces in England and Wales.
As far as I'm aware, with my last investigation, as I say, all bar 3 forces across England and Wales and Scotland, apart from Scotland, all bar 3 forces have taken it on board.
And you may not know the answer to this, but is this a matter of time before Police Scotland sign up to this course, or are there maybe reasons why they're not signing up?
As I say, obviously it's their decision whether or not they've decided. I would recommend inclusion of that particular style of training across the whole of the country. As I said, the benefits are obvious, and the take-up has been tremendous. So I would highly recommend that Police Scotland at least consider looking at the process and signing up for the licence for the trainers going through College of Policing.
And you've described that as scenario-based and performance-based.
Yes.
And is the view now that that is one of the most effective ways of delivering training to officers?
It's always been seen as probably the most effective way of getting certainly behavioural training in relation to physical skills and applying that, testing that knowledge in a live situation. As I say, it is labour intensive and it is resource intensive. So it has been something that I think forces have shied away from in relation to cost and abstraction time. But it is certainly something now that I think, with the work and the evidence that's been gathered, some of which I've produced for the chair as in my attachments, the research that's gone into it over the last sort of 4 years, I think, you know, evidences the requirement for change.
And if the chair wants to look into this new PPST programme, what would be the best place to look?
I'm sure the College of Policing would be happy to provide an overview of the programme. There's a short précis that I've included in my documentation. The full programme would have to be taken from the College of Policing.
Thank you. And I think Appendix P for Papa of your report says ACPO PST Manual 2007 Conflict Management Model, but I don't think it's that that is linked. But there is JI.
Public and Personal Safety Training, APP. That's the approved professional practice in relation to content and what forces would have to follow to implement it.
Lovely. So it's Appendix J that would be the best one to look at
It
for
would,
further
yes.
detail.
It doesn't give the full programme in
No.
relation to what it contains, but that would have to be provided by College of Policing.
Thank you very much. Can we move on now to question F? And if we look at page 22 of your report, the principles of preclusion, justification and necessity in relation to the use of force.
Yes.
So the inquiry team have asked you to comment on this specific issue and what trainings was available and is available now. And you've pointed out at section 1 that in relation to, well, really at any point, the legal standpoint of preclusion is unique to Scotland as the main point when justifying any use of force. In England and Wales, the approach is one of reasonable in the circumstances, with focus on the necessity of its use. So the question is, did the officer need to use force? Was that force reasonable in the circumstances? And then they can look to see if a less intrusive option was available. So is it fair to say that in England and Wales, they do still consider whether a less intrusive or less forceful option was available?
Yes, that's correct.
So that is part of consideration of use of force in England and Wales?
Yes, that's correct.
But the term preclusion is used uniquely in Scotland?
It is, yes.
You've identified that preclusion is mentioned in the 2013 manual, and you give that at the latter part of your answer 1. Page 5, and you talk about there being a few small paragraphs on this. And the very last sentence mentions the MDM and that it should be considered at all times. The accompanying lesson plans appear to give the trainer some minimal guidance on delivery and contextualisation in addition to this, but do not hold any manual references. So, having considered the paperwork and looked for this concept of preclusion, what was your view about the content in 2015 that was available in Police Scotland?
It doesn't provide a great deal of explanation into how preclusion sits within a justifiable use of force. It really sort of, I think, rather than justifying what has been done with preclusion, it actually sort of steers or guides an officer into explaining why they didn't do something, hence the terminology preclusion, rather than concentrating on explaining what they actually did and why they did it, and then as a secondary requirement explaining why they may not have chosen a less intrusive option. An example based on the way UK officers or officers in England are trained, an officer may use a baton strike. So I would look for the explanation from the officer and the justification for that baton strike, and then that would be followed by a question of, well, did you consider using an incapacitant? Did you consider using a restraint tool? And then at the answer being yes or no, and if it was no, why didn't you consider it? If you did consider it, why did you rule it out? So the preclusion comes after the justification and explanation of why the force that was used in those circumstances, and then the preclusion comes afterwards. The emphasis within the use of force section within the Scottish manual very much looks at that preclusion as the first element, and then the justification or the reasonableness of the actions afterwards.
Thank you. And what would you have expected to see in the 2013 manual about preclusion, which you didn't see?
I think some simple terminology, some simple questions. I think a bit further on I explain this in section 3 in relation to simple terminology. As I've just said, what did you do? Why did you do it? What was your rationale? What were your impact factors you considered to justify that action? Simple questions that an officer can can relate to, rather than trying to get their head around a legality issue and understanding a term of law.
So in section 3, which is on page 23, this is where you talk about the training that's available from College of Policing.
Yes, and also the emphasis that's placed upon it.
And the emphasis, as well as the content. And this is where we see the examples of the questions.
Yes.
That you would expect an officer, presumably, to be able to respond to. And that would be the type of thing you would have thought would be in the 2013 manual.
Yes, I say if we were running scenario training, even back then, when scenarios, they would be the questions that we would be asking the officer as part of the debriefing process, that have dealt with the situation. We would have ended it, and those are the sorts of questions I would be asking. Why did you do what you did? Did you consider? Why did you rule it out?
So if one was being trained by the College of Policing at that time, you talk about the terminology that was sometimes used being what was least intrusive, or you shouldn't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut.
Yes, that's very much part of the training around human rights application, which looks at that particular area.
And using simple questions, simple words, simple phrases that people can understand.
Yes.
And you've looked at the training available at that time, and I think in section 2, which is back on page 22 at the bottom, you say you were asked to express a view on whether that training was fit for purpose, and you said, in my opinion, no, it was not. And you say, firstly, the NDM was not covered until page 18 of this module. We've covered that with you. You talk about Module 1 of the 2013 manual, halfway down that paragraph, did not provide any practical examples or stated cases to assist officers in rationalising this information. It used outdated models and terminology which had been removed in the MPCC OST manual and discontinued elsewhere in the UK. And one aspect there, do you think that using practical examples or case scenarios is actually a useful way of sharing information with trainees?
I think it is, certainly around use of force. Not that everyone is slightly different, but it does give a baseline to officers in relation to what might be accepted and reasons why things might be deemed as necessary. And as I say, that missing, as I testified yesterday, that missing element of the circumstances in which the officers find themselves is a very important and relevant context for others sitting outside to understand why an officer might have done something or why they might have gone down a certain route, a certain tactical option, because the circumstances to them may have appeared different to as they actually were, or may have changed or been found not to be true. But the belief and the understanding of the officer at that time is one of the important elements that needs to be considered when officers are trying to justify use of force.
Mm. So in your experience, do real life scenarios, whether it's hearing from individual officers who've been through an incident or seeing a video of that, or real life scenarios from cases and other inquests and other reviews in different jurisdictions, does that have a greater resonance with people who are training to become police officers or who are police officers?
I think it does, yes. As I said, there are some stated cases held within the MPCC manual. There have been some updated ones recently which just look at those different elements of justification of use of force, looking at reasonableness, necessity, and the circumstances where officers have made mistakes but on an honest held belief. So there is merit in using those, but with a caveat and a caution that that's not the black and white answer that the officer may be looking for, that we are looking at an area that is subjective and is dependent upon the review of a third party, such as an inquest or a court.
I mean, it is something we commonly hear, that you can learn more from your mistakes than from things that you do well.
I would concur with that, yes.
Can we move on to the next page? I'd like to continue with paragraph 2. You say, I do not believe that officers would be able to fully grasp the concept of this important subject, and as such may struggle to apply this knowledge in an operational context. I think they would struggle to later attempt to justify any action taken based on this minimal information. And what you're saying here in relation to not just being trained and being given knowledge and information, but applying that in an operational context. I'm interested in that section.
As I say, I think using scenarios or using examples, real examples of how officers may justify actions or choose certain tactical options based on the information. That's imperative for them to get a fuller grasp of, rather than just this is. It very much appears in that section that it's you have power to do this from this, and then there's nothing else to sort of explain how that might apply to a live situation or to an incident that they may be dealing with.
And so maybe knowing about the legal position may have limitations for someone who struggles to understand how it can be applied in an operational setting.
Yes, I think it's the practical application of that which is missing, and it's an imperative area that officers need to understand. Otherwise, they are going to either shy away from using force when it is appropriate, or they're going to use force and then struggle to understand and explain their rationale for using that particular tactical technique in that situation.
Thank you. And then moving on to 2022, or the current position, I think it's section 6 of your response here. Current Police Scotland training is covered in the 2022 OST manual, and this now includes a more substantial module, Module 1, which is now specific to use of force, as well as a new Module 17 looking at tactical report writing in more detail and specifically around justification.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about the current position in Police Scotland?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned there, that the second section is something that was included in the 2012 MPCC manual, where it gives practical guidance in relation to justifying and using the NDM as a model to assist in justification and writing their notes or their accounts of a situation. Understanding the important things to include, the different areas of legality that need to be hit when you are explaining or giving an account. That practicality of just those simple things to include in your notes is a very, very good learning tool, and it gives an aid memoir to officers who are sitting down and then trying to explain or document their thought processes.
Thank you. And then I think it's section 7, which we can see on the screen. You say, I believe the current training is fit for purpose in this area.
Yes, I do, yeah.
So those improvements have now resulted in the training being fit for purpose.
Yes.
Okay. And can we then move on to question G, which we see at the bottom of page, is it 23? And this is the question that related to training on profiled offender behaviour and reasonable officer response. This should include, but is not necessarily exclusive to, circumstances in which the following are a reasonable officer response: the drawing of CS or PAVA spray, the use of CS spray and use of PAVA spray if different, the use of batons, restraint, the use of handcuffs, the use of leg restraints. And I think we've touched on some aspects of this already in your evidence. I think in section 1, you talk about the 2013 manual and the sections that cover these aspects of the training. You've said this is only 2 pages. And then at 2, whilst the information in this section is not in itself incorrect, it appears that the NDM has just been added to the old content at the end of the section.
Yes.
We've covered that. And no effort has been made to integrate it or fully understand that it was designed to replace other models which are still referred to in this section. So we've talked about this yesterday and today, and this again feeds into some of the issues and concerns you have regarding this aspect of training as well. And you talk about the manual not following a logical pattern, and you say it does not flow, and I think you mentioned that yesterday. Now, with College of Policing in 2015, you've discussed this at section 3, and you talk about the 2012 NPCC OST manual.
Yes.
And by this time, with College of Policing, by 2012, they'd completely removed the levels for profile subject behaviour and reasonable officer response.
Yes, they were still there, but they weren't numbered in a sort of a what might appear to be an escalating ladder or a de-escalating ladder. The actual subject matter, the headings were still there, but there was more crossover whereby certain tactical options could be considered earlier on or later on in the system. So there was a lot of duplication in the options that were available to officers across those various subject profile behaviour.
I think we discussed this yesterday about the possible confusion that could arise, and so that had been addressed by the College of Policing by simply removing those references in that sort of ladder or
going more to the fact of officers being able to better understand and better account for and justify their actions.
Thank you. And then looking at the current training delivered by Police Scotland, I think you address this at 6.
Yes.
And you talk about the current OST manual. You say it fully incorporates the NDM and uses it as the fundamental process to apply to assessing situations. And there are still some materials used elsewhere from the MPCC manual that would assist officers in fully understanding and applying these principles. That include an aid memoir, accountability graphics in their conflict management section. That's the College of Policing documents.
Yes, they're held within that section within the manual, and they could quite easily just be lifted across to assist an officer.
So there may be some useful graphics that could be shared with College of Policing. Yes. But essentially at 7, which we see right at the bottom, you now consider that the Police Scotland training in this specific area is fit for purpose.
I do, yes.
And that's not to say that further evolutions won't take place, but as the materials you looked at, they were fit for purpose.
Yes, and as I say, we've had 2 years. I'm sure there's been some development in that time as well.
And you've said that College of Policing are continuing to develop and support the documentation that they use and to improve their own training.
Yes, and as I mentioned there about the new approved professional practice, which I mentioned for the PPST programme, that's only just been released. So that's, again, further development from 2022 from the College of Policing.
Thank you. And then if we can look at H, which is the final question that was specifically asked of you. And this relates to, and perhaps we can look back at section 4 just to refresh or actually maybe just look at page 25, I think it is. Yes, page 25. Look at H and it's at the top. And the inquiry team asked, restraint, insofar as it relates to the application of weight and or pressure applied to the subject during restraint, number of officers involved, length of restraint, the use of a safety officer, officer to monitor breathing of the subject, any risk to life caused by restraint. So this topic was to asking you to comment on the training that was given by Police Scotland in relation to restraint and matters involving restraint.
Yes.
And at 1, you say the 2013 OST manual covers these topics in relation to positional asphyxia, which we've talked about today.
Yes.
It highlights the increased risk of placing pressure onto a prone subject. As previously mentioned, the information was outdated and did not fully reflect that being provided across the rest of the UK. And we've talked about that earlier today. You talk about the manual that's available with MPCC manual on medical implications and guidance that's given. And you've said that with Police Scotland you could find no specific mention of the role of safety officer within the 2013 manual.
No.
And you've looked at the lesson plans, you've looked at other materials, you couldn't find any reference, specific reference to the safety officer.
No, I couldn't. Not that particular situation, no.
No. You said the length of time a restraint can take to successfully be achieved can vary massively, dependent on a number of factors, and you list those in bullet points there. And they can include the size and weight comparison between subject and officers. And officers are taught or were taught that any prone restraint should be kept to a minimum and no more than was absolutely necessary to achieve full restraint of a subject, but no specific time limit was placed on that.
That's correct. Yes.
And we've heard evidence that there is no time limit that could be considered safe. So one could not tell officers, if you only restrain for a certain period of time, that will be safe, because that's just not the situation in real life.
No, as you know, taking those bullet points ahead, every situation and every subject is different.
Right. And you said that was the same within the Police Scotland materials and the MPCC training. And finally, you were unable to establish if during training the option to disengage was discussed.
Yes.
So there wasn't any specific mention of the option of simply disengaging and moving away from the subject. Now, we've heard evidence that one option would be to say, this restraint isn't working, the subject is too vigorous, too violent, struggling to such an extreme level that we cannot get this person restrained without taking too long and involving too much force. So an option for officers is to walk away. Could you find any reference to that as an option in the training materials for Police
I couldn't find
Scotland?
any reference in the training material. As I said, it may be something that's been discussed by trainers. It would certainly be something from the MPCC training that we would certainly discuss with them, that option of if you can't complete the restraint and you're losing control or struggling to control them, consider that withdrawal and that disengagement.
But that would be very much dependent on the individual trainer.
Yes.
And you were asked at section 2 if you thought the training in relation to, if I can call it restraint in the broadest terms, was fit for purpose, and you said no, you didn't think it was.
No.
It did not mention such factors as the subject's requirement for oxygen or explanation of the breathing mechanism, and how handcuffing or securing the arms and shoulders could also increase the risk of asphyxiation. Now, that was something, the subject's requirement for oxygen, that I think Dr. Montgomery on the video spoke about specifically.
Yes.
But you couldn't find any reference to that in the Police Scotland materials?
Not within the position asphyxia guidance, no.
And whilst it raised awareness, it is my opinion that insufficient time or importance was given to this subject, considering the work that was being carried out in other forces to highlight these risks.
Yes.
And part of that is, for example, the work that you've described College of Policing doing, which resulted in the video of 2006.
Yes.
It would not make officers fully aware of the risk factors and actions that could be taken to minimise these risks. So what was your concern about an officer who had received this training with Police Scotland when they were out on operational duties? Given you've raised these concerns about them not being fully aware of the risk factors and actions that could be taken to minimise those risks?
I think one important bit of information is it was actually used as a tool on the video. The fact that somebody's talking to you does not necessarily mean that they are not asphyxiating, they're not struggling. And it's that understanding that it's about the ability to take oxygen in, but also to exhale carbon dioxide to to remove that acidosis and that toxicity from the body. So a person may be able to talk, may be able to respond verbally, but that does not mean that they are not struggling to breathe or to exhale that carbon dioxide at that time. And that's very much, I hear it quite a lot from different cases that I've been involved in, that, well, the person was saying, I'm okay, or get off me, therefore they were breathing. Yes, they were, but were they breathing to such an extent that allowed them to take in the oxygen that they required, or to exhale and get rid of the toxins that they need to survive?
And the message that was being delivered by Dr. Montgomery in the 2006 video, do you see that as an important message that should be shared with officers?
Yes, I think without that sort of caveat of being able to disengage an unsuccessful or a prolonged restraint, as he touched on that fact of that the person struggles more violently, therefore more restraint is used or heavier restraint is used, and the person is struggling because they need to breathe, and it's that vicious circle of relation to more force being used against more resistance.
And I think that's what Dr. Montgomery described it
Yes.
as. And then you've also pointed out that in relation to the number of officers involved in a restraint, you could find no specific reference to a minimum or maximum, and that reflected other training across the UK.
Yes, as I said, normally the limbs, legs, arms and head would normally be, so a minimum of 4 officers, sometimes 5 or possibly even more, depending on the circumstances.
Thank you. And in section 3, which is towards the bottom of the page, you talk about the training that was delivered at that time by College of Policing. And we've looked at the video already, and you also say that, let me just see, there's a section, yes, the mention of a safety officer has been part of OST training in relation to prone restraint, ABD and positional asphyxia since around 2009. Now, I noticed that it was mentioned in the 2006 video, but you think that's been part of OST training since 2009?
It went into the national manual in 2009.
Right. So it was part of the video earlier, 3 years before that?
Yes.
And then it was put into the actual national manual 3 years later?
Yes, it was guidance or advice that had been given to the Met in relation to that particular review. That review and that evidence was then taken to the national level by myself, and was eventually incorporated into the next rewrite of the manual, which from memory was 2009.
And as was said on the video, it's not a rank-specific role. So all the officers are taught, because at any stage, any one of them could be asked to take on that role.
Yes, I mean, any officer could, depending on how they arrive, could end up at the head. And what we say is that's the best position to be. So the person at the head is the best person to control and monitor that situation.
And I think a point that's made by you earlier today and on the video, that it's recognised that the person controlling the head of the subject is probably in the best position to monitor and communicate with the subject.
Yes, definitely.
So it's not just monitoring, there is an element of communication also.
Yes, it's trying to use the de-escalation tools, communicate with that individual, advise them, trying to get them to comply with the stop resisting.
And that communication process doesn't stop even once the restraint starts?
No, because part of that role is also communicating with the other officers, so telling the other officers what needs to happen and making sure that they're not doing things that are contrary to what the other officers are doing. So it's about a controlling situation as well as communicating and monitoring the subject.
And if we can look at the next page, 5, and you say here, having taken the decision to restrain the subject, officers would still have to control and secure the subject. However, I believe with the increased knowledge around this subject provided elsewhere at that time, the hypothetical officer's awareness of monitoring and the increased risk factors, exertion, length of control, restraint period, likelihood of drinking drugs would most likely have been at the forefront of their minds.
Yes.
So if an officer had received the type of training we observed in the video, or that was available in the College of Policing at that stage, you think that would have had an impact on behaviour if we look at the hypothetical reasonable officer?
I would hope that it would have raised their concerns and made them look at the other options that were available to them, including disengagement.
Thank you. And then you've looked at the current position and moved on, the 2022 position, and considered that. And you've said that it's now fit for purpose.
Yes, as I said, the only thing I wasn't able to fully rationalise was the fact of how much time is actually given within that refresher period to the particular subject.
So that element of the refresher training and the amount of time spent has not been information that you've been able to glean from the materials.
No.
But subject to that one reservation, you believe the current training now is fit for purpose?
Yes, definitely.
So there's been a change since 2015.
Yes.
Thank you. And again, looking at the current position with College of Policing, we've already heard from the Met in relation to that video that reflects a much older set of training. But you've said here, understanding and training on this has continued to be developed across the UK, and Police Scotland have had access to this information. And again, you've told us about College of Policing and the substantial inroads they've made in this area.
Yes, and I've produced some documentation that specifically looks at ABD guidance from the College of Policing, and also lesson notes, etc., from 2015 input that was given to trainers.
Thank you. And we'll find that in the appendices at the rear of your report.
You will, yes.
You've provided those documents to the inquiry. I'd like to move on to page 26, please. This is where you provide us with a summary of your conclusions. And paragraph A, you refer again to the reviews that we looked at. Yes, well, you discussed yesterday. That were 2010 and 2015. And you talk about both identifying similar problems and issues with OST and its delivery. And you said little or no work had been introduced between the first and second report. And if anything, that situation may have worsened as the management appears to have been lost, as there is no evidence of strategic oversight or national leadership in relation to OST from the 2015 report.
Yes.
And you indicate that this would have had a significant impact on both the content, quality and emphasis placed on this important area of police training.
Yes.
And you've identified at B a number of the problems, and you say these could have been addressed earlier if a work stream had been put in place by Police Scotland to coordinate the amalgamation of the Scottish forces, which took place in 2013.
Yes.
And so your view is that those issues could have been addressed at an earlier stage?
I believe with the two reports, certainly the 2010, I would have expected that to be incorporated in the rationale and strategic overview of the formation of Police Scotland, and then to see the same very similar report being produced 5 years later with similar recommendations is a surprise.
And you describe that as a massive opportunity being missed to create a robust system of OST delivery and oversight by the new service.
Yes.
And at C on the next page, you also highlight a point here that you mentioned yesterday, that it doesn't really matter what documents were applicable at the time or have been produced for the inquiry, due to the fragmented and unmonitored way that OST was delivered across the force area at that time. We have no way of knowing whether the officers concerned received what was expected or required. Even the SOPs in place to support this training were also lacking in detail, in some instances contradictory, and they offered minimal strategic guidance to staff. So not just the content is the issue, but the actual delivery is the issue. And you've said from the 2015 report, that was Inspector Young's, that it was clear there were large discrepancies in content and how it was being delivered across the force area, with no identified process for monitoring training delivery at the local level. No method of standardisation was in place, even to check trainers were delivering what was expected.
That's correct, yes.
So had the training been provided in a way that was consistent and monitored, would you have expected that the officers would have had better training prior to 2015?
Subject to my earlier comments, yes, I think, you know, that ability to prove that at least a standard was being achieved and was being followed would allow us to understand exactly what they were being taught and then better identify where those spaces or lacking areas were.
Thank you. And then at D, you say information being provided was dated and not in line with that being provided across the rest of the country.
Yes.
And overall, at E, it's your opinion that in 2015 the lack of oversight is likely to have allowed variations in techniques and the supporting information being provided to officers, and as such strategic control had been lost, leaving officers exposed to being taught incorrect skills or misleading information. Is that correct? But you have said in F that there are marked improvements in the content and manner in which OST is being delivered, and this includes the recertification programme for the trainers themselves.
Yes.
So is it fair to say that generally overall, although there are some areas where you've said there continue to be issues, that in some areas there have been significant improvements?
Yes, I think the most important part of that is the fact that there is now a process in place not only for the review and monitoring of the trainers and the training, but also the content and that constant improvement and development of the product of the programme is now in place, and that with that system there, it can only improve and continue to get better.
Thank you. Could you allow me one moment, please, Mr. Graves? I appreciate that we're slightly early, but I'm about to move on to a completely different subject, and I wondered if I could be allowed to rise. We could be allowed to rise early to allow me
Yes,
to
in these circumstances, we'll rise now and continue with your evidence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
We'll now adjourn.